Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to LSE for this event today. My name is Facundo Alvaredo. I am Professorial Research Fellow at the International Inequalities Institute at LSE and co-director of the World Inequality Lab. I am pleased to be here today for Branko Milanovic's presentation of his latest book that he will be commenting. I have to give you some information. Of course, Branko, you know Branko. Branko is a research professor at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. He is a senior scholar at the Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality, also at the City University of New York. And he is a visiting professor at the International Inequalities Institute with us at LSE. Today, Branko will be presenting visions of inequality from the French Revolution to the end of the Cold War. And I have a few organizational points to mention. For Twitter users, the hashtag for today's event is hashtag LSEIII. This event is being recorded and will hopefully be made available as a podcast, subject to no technical difficulties. As usual, there will be space for you to post questions and comments, both from the online audience and for you present in the theater today. For those who are online, you can send your questions and comments while Branko is making his presentation through your quick Q&A facility at the bottom of the screen. And please mention your name and your affiliation. And we are particularly keen to receiving questions from LSE alumni and students and staff. For those of you in the audience, you know how this works. You will raise your hands and I will pick up some of the questions, and please also give your name and affiliations. I am just chairing this event. I am not a commentator, but I feel obliged to say something about Branko's book. And I would like to say that I want to stress one very positive feature of the book, according to my reading, which is not necessarily the center of the book, and is not necessarily the center of Branko's intention when writing the book. The great authors Branko is reviewing, Smith, Ricardo, Marx, they force in a way Branko to use a peculiar word. That word is exploitation. I counted the word exploitation in the book 29 times, including footnotes and the main text, 29 times. And this is extraordinary because you don't see, and you know it, you don't see the word exploitation being used much. And if you go through bestsellers, when they use the other bestsellers, when they use the word exploitation, they refer to, sadly, exploitation of data. But somehow, the ghosts of Smith, Ricardo, and Marx make their way through Branko's book to us today to remind us three things. And again, this is my reading of one of the aspects of the book. One is that all human societies, since the inception of agriculture, have been based on exploitation. No matter what the dominant doctrines sell or what the dominant doctrines want to sell, want us to buy. Second, that there will be no total true human autonomy without the end of exploitation. And third, and this is something that we see a lot in Branko's book, is that in order for this exploitation to end, there's a lot of much theoretical work needed, much theoretical work to be done. With that, I hand the floor to Branko for his presentation.
Well, thank you very much for coming this evening, which is quite nice. So I guess that, you know, let me use the economistic language, the loss of utility that you experience through not enjoying this evening may be somewhat compensated by the interest of the presentation. I hope so. I am, of course, always extremely happy to be at LSE, that I'm actually now, in some sense, on a home ground, since I'm affiliated with, as Facundo said, with the Institute for International Inequalities. And, but it's always, I think, very special to be here. I would address Facundo's points a little bit later, so let me go through my presentation that I hope would take about 35 to 40 minutes. You know, this is not easy to present a book which essentially looks at or interprets 200 years of what the most important economists have written on income distribution in half an hour. So I will have to be very selective in what I present. But to give you an idea of what is in the book, I want to mention something about the structure of the book. There are 6 really big authors in the book, and I'm sure that in the Q&A you're going to ask me about the others who are not included in the book. So I'm not going to prejudge what you would say, but I know that questions like that would come. The 6 who are there are François Quesnay, which, as you know, had written actually before the French Revolution. So that's basically a beginning of political economy. Then, obviously, then, as Facundo said, there is not much of a doubt about the choice of the next 3, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Karl Marx. And for somebody who looks actually at income distribution of inequality and inequality, I think there is also very little choice in the, very little doubt about the choice of the next 2 authors, Vilfredo Pareto and then Simon Kuznets. As you can see, the names kind of end around the time when Kuznets was writing his pieces on income distribution. So we are talking between 1955 and 1965 or 68. And then I discussed that period of eclipse, what I call the eclipse, where I try to understand why income distribution was not really studied much during that period. It is a complex chapter which has, I think, more than 100 pages. I would only briefly mention it because I think there will be questions raised there, but I intentionally don't want to have a presentation focus on that part because that really leads us immediately to sort of, how should I say, confrontational views. And I think that, honestly, to come to a very negative conclusion about the eclipse and why there was an eclipse, I think one really needs to read the previous authors and why they were different. Why is that they studied social classes? Why did they actually use the word, as Facundo said, exploitation? Why did they see the society as being stratified? Why did they see, as Pareto did, the society being composed of the elite and everybody else? And why is it that suddenly in the 1970s we have only agents, that capital kind of disappears, that capital becomes just one asset like many others? So we are all, you know, we all have assets, but you have capital, I have labor, fine, we're just going to make this very simple. We'll just have A, and there will be a subscript K for capital, or L for labor, or something like that. So there is really a big change. I will, as I said, will not go into that chapter other than just to give you an idea that there I present a very critical view of income distribution studies under socialism and income distribution studies under capitalism. And I think it's important also to realize that the two were related, that essentially the claim of classlessness which existed in socialist societies produced an equal claim of classlessness, especially in the United States. And that, I think, was the reason why we went into an eclipse. Which doesn't mean that there were no studies per se. Of course, there are lots of empirical work, but there were not studies which were what I called integrative studies. And my epilogue is much more optimistic because I think in the beginning of the 21st century, we had a return of inequality studies. And that's why actually you're here to listen about the book, because there is a return. The topic has become very important again. Now, this is a timeline of the author studied. I will not go obviously through all the years, but what is interesting here is to look at the colors. And what you notice, the coloring is of the how should I say, indicates the same time period. So what is interesting here is that, for example, when you think of Quesnay, Smith, and Ricardo, you see that when Quesnay died in 1774 was around the same time when The Wealth of Nations were published, and it was about the same time when Ricardo was born. So you see the generational issue. Likewise, you see it between Ricardo and Marx, and you see it between Marx and Pareto. Interesting detail, and there are quite a few details of what the French call la petite histoire in my book. Marx was in Paris in 1948, and Pareto was born in Paris in 1848. And then there is a greater gap, I think, between Pareto and Kuznets. The work on income distribution then was more methodological. If you were to take big names, then you would have probably Gini, Lawrence, and so on. It was more methodological. But and I also put there some important events so we can situate them better in time. The main idea is the one that is actually the second written here. I try to imagine, it's not done in a mechanical way, but I try to imagine the following situation. If I were to ask from each of the 6 authors to write like an essay with a title, what forces in your view determine income distribution, and how do you see income distribution evolving in the future as societies advance? So I was, if you read each of those chapters, I was always in the author's corner. So I had critiques of several of the authors, but I tried really to look at the world through their eyes, meaning their situation in time and place. And I think it is very important to realize that at what time did each of them write and where. So the second section, the first section for each author has some historical details. It's not Wikipedia. I didn't do ChatGPT. I actually looked at what I thought were things that are somewhat known, but not maybe too much well known. To give you some ideas, but it's from their lives. I think that, for example, Ricardo, when he died, if you convert his wealth, was probably the wealthiest economist who ever sort of wealth converted into wages of the time, was probably the wealthiest economist who ever lived among the tribe of economists. I think it's interesting that Marx's own somewhat cosmopolitan background within Europe, but still is not very well appreciated. The fact that, of course, he's a German philosopher, as Kolakowski begins his main currents of Marxism, is true, but people don't forget or don't know his Dutch connection through his mother, obviously his Judaism, or actually not his own, but because the family converted just before his birth, and also the fact that Trier, where he was born, was very Francophile and the Francophone part, which was part until 1815, was part of German Confederation, which was controlled by the French. So, as I said, it could have happened that had not Napoleon been beaten in 1815, Marx would have studied in Paris, not in Berlin. So there are such details, and of course also another interesting detail from the lives is probably, of course, people know that Adam Smith had all his writings burned. I mean, the unpublished writings burned before his death, and I said actually there was no Max Brod for him. He wanted to make sure that actually they are burned just before he died. And also there was a little bit of an enigma that people mention about his wealth, because he really had very high incomes for quite some time, and his estate is not sufficiently rich when he died. So there was a little bit of enigma what happened with that money. I mean, some people actually, early biographers would emphasize that it was probably that he was engaging in acts of secret charity. It's possible, we don't know. But I think it's interesting to have this. So this is individual element. The second section always is about income distribution at the place and time where the authors lived. So clearly then for Ricardo, it was the early 19th century in the UK, in England. And then of Marx, it was, I put also Germany there, obviously the UK and Germany, Pareto, France and Italy, and Simon Kuznets, the United States, and obviously Quesnay, France, and so on. I think it's important because we see better the environment which technically they knew. Because when I say technically, there were no numbers like that which they had. And I'm actually sorry that I forgot, I wanted to include that in presentation, but just thought of this now. The ending of the chapter on Marx is, I think, interesting because what I realized as I was reading, there was a footnote in Marx which talks about tabulations from the UK, English/Welsh and Irish data from 1864-65, 2 years before the publication of Capital, where he gives tabulation of, I think, Schedule C with profit taxes, and they're like, how many people above, I don't know, 2,000 pounds and between 1,500 and 2,000 and so on. Interesting thing which occurred to me, okay, let's put that in a double log format that was used by Pareto. And of course, what you get the Pareto line in Marx. Actually, Marx did not do that. But you see there the connection, because exactly the same tabulations from cities in Italy, states in Germany, were used by Pareto only 30 years later, 30 years later, to actually argue that income distribution doesn't change under different conditions, under different social structure, and actually to argue against Marx. But I thought it interesting to look at these connections, which unless you study the authors as in a continuum, you would not necessarily see or pay attention. I mean, I'm not the first one who actually noticed that I think I'm not the first one who noticed the tabulation in Marx, but I don't know that anybody has linked it to Pareto's later work. You realize how close they were in some sense methodologically. And then I define what I call the integrative studies of income distribution, especially in order to argue how the eclipse happened and why the eclipse happened, and why when we talk about the eclipse in the latter part of the 20th century, we do not have together a narrative, a theory, and an empirical confirmation. We have lots of empirical work. We have lots of theory which is unrelated to anything alive on this earth, and we don't then have much of a narrative. So I think it's only in the early 21st century that we have this reintegration which the classical authors definitely had in their own work. So let me now go very briefly over some characteristics of the four key classical authors. And I think the most important thing there, and I will not go through each of these lines, but the most important thing is to realize that they have class stratified societies in mind. So that's very clear with Quesnay, and that's why, of course, Quesnay was so much liked by Marx for two reasons. First of all, that's the first introduction of class structure in economics. And Quesnay essentially replicates the French pre-revolutionary class structure. He has more than 3 classes. He has, depending on which book you use, but between 7 and 10. But the important part is that there are 3 top classes. There are clergy, aristocracy, and clergy, landowners, which are oftentimes aristocracy, and government. Now, the second important thing that Marx really took from Quesnay was the idea that you have to have a surplus in production, not in exchange as mercantilists thought, but in production to pay incomes of these 3 classes. And each of them produces something, clergy produces some, sort of sustenance, religious sustenance. The government produces in principle peace, and landlords supply land. But it was the surplus, the idea of the surplus and class structure, which is very important in Quesnay. I could actually go on about Quesnay quite a lot. As I mentioned in my book, I said Quesnay somehow, I think, appeals a lot to masochistic economists, because reading Quesnay is a little bit of an exercise in his masochistic tendencies, because he's not easy not easy author to read, and very sometimes intentionally vague, or sometimes intentionally paradoxical. And then, of course, he has quite a few numbers, including the social table for France, but these numbers were, how should I say, there were even arithmetical errors in the numbers and so on. So there are really lots of things there. But what is important for all of them is that they have class structure, that they have a ranking. We know which class is the richest, which is the second, which is the third, and so on. Obviously, the classical authors are have the ranking landlords, capitalists, workers. Implicitly, there is no overlap. So you cannot be a rich worker, because it kind of analytically, they don't use that. That doesn't mean, and I will show in a minute, actually, for Marx actually starts studying the French society in the sociological writings, he actually realizes that, of course, not realizes, he writes about the fact that there is an overlap. But analytically, you essentially have no overlap. You know, think of people like us who work with Gini coefficient. What it means, essentially, is that they have three classes with the share of population and the mean income of the class. There is no overlap component, and within inequality is very low. Because essentially the argument is, yeah, sure, there are some richer capitalists and some poorer, some landlords with more land and landlords with less, but there is no overlap, and every landlord is rich by almost definition. Not almost, it is by definition rich. And finally, each individual or household has a single source of income, which comes from the three assets, if you will, and that determines its position in income distribution. So this is, I think, a summarized view that they had, and if you want to kind of put it in, you know, sort of like a graph, in a graphical way, this is what you would essentially have. You would actually have, obviously, workers as the most numerous group, but with the lowest income and with small inequality in distribution. And of course, I would actually argue that even analytically, there is some inequality, particularly I would argue that with respect to Marx, because I think Marx is very often misinterpreted on that, but I will come to that in a minute. So that would be the structure. And that tripartite structure then, of course, became the bread and butter of classical economics and neoclassical economics, I mean, to some extent in the beginning of neoclassical economics. Although that was, of course, then a replica of a very special structure which existed in England and the United Kingdom, because clearly, as you can see here in this slide, the real structure was all, of course, class-based, but they were different, the tendency laws and in the rest of Europe, and much more so in the rest of the world, were different. And of course, the presence of coerced labor was present in Europe and in the Americas and in Asia and in Africa. And after Quesnay, essentially with Smith and afterwards, we do not have any big role of forced labor or slavery, although, and this I will not speak about that today, although it's very interesting to read what Smith was thinking about slavery, and also obviously Marx and Marx's point of view, defense of the North versus the South, which was based, of course, on his view that the North represents a different and more developed social structure, or maybe you can call it a social formation, and the South is an inferior one, and the acceptance of the use of force is overthrowing that society. But however, in Marx's sociological and historical writings, the class structure is much more nuanced. I think actually of the three authors, it is the least nuanced in Ricardo, because the whole work of Ricardo is what I call, it's basically mathematics written in words. And the class structure is so sharp, like in statements when he says that there is only one effective cause that can reduce profits, and that's the increase in wages. So it's really the class structure and the whole model, the key model, is the model between, of course, as you know, what would happen if the corn laws remain in force, and how the landlords would become richer and richer because you would use much more expensive the land, which is less fertile and hence more expensive to produce food on, and then gradually that would squeeze all the profits and so on. So the model is entirely class-based. But with Pareto, the distinction is, as I said before, the elite versus the rest. Kuznets, the distinction, as we know, is the type of employment and the place of employment, so rural versus urban, and manufacturing versus agricultural. And finally, for neoclassics, everybody is just the same. But Marx, in his actual work, when he sort of departs from the analytical sort of view of the three classes, or actually in Marx really they become two, because landlords, as he says, are essentially capitalists who happen to own land. It becomes much more complex, and I'm giving here the examples from Class Struggles in France and from Capital in Volume 3. I will not go through all of that, but the important part is to realize that workers, of course, are not all uniform. They are peasants, they are workers, there is lumpenproletariat, which you might call déclassé people, and very importantly, they are self-employed, and they are people who own their own land. So, you know, the class structure, obviously in France at that time, was not as simple as that analytical classification that I mentioned before. Now, I would discuss only Smith and Marx in the rest of the presentation so that we don't spend several hours here. And I would actually want to focus on what I think are novelties in the book, in the interpretation of Smith and interpretation of Marx. First, my point one about Smith is the difference between TMS, Theory of Moral Sentiments, and The Wealth of Nations. Now, this is kind of very old. Everybody who has read these two books comes to the same conclusion. But I come to a same conclusion, but different, in the following sense, to make it very clear. I believe that that The Wealth of Nations is much more of a leftist, I could not say proto-socialist, book than the Theory of Moral Sentiments. The reason is the following, that, and I think it's very striking when you read them together, and you think of that in the back of your mind. The Theory of Moral Sentiments derides, ridicules, makes fun of the rich. It is kind of a Veblenesque, you know, before obviously Veblen. Sometimes it's Panglossian because it essentially says, well, you know, yes, there are differences in income and wealth, but the grand maker is really taking care of the poor because maybe they have less, certainly they have less income and wealth, but they have more security, they have maybe greater happiness. So what Smith does is a very clever move from a plane of income or wealth distribution to a plane of personal satisfaction of happiness. When he says a beggar who is sunning himself on next to the road enjoys greater security than a king. And in some sense, then you say, okay, really, we should look at happiness. So a beggar who actually is feeling fine because nobody's going to kill him for, you know, to steal anything, and who doesn't have to work, in some sense, really maybe is equally happy as a very rich landlord. It sometimes actually becomes really somewhat absurd when, particularly that statement in a paragraph which says that essentially it doesn't matter how the land is divided up, because even people who don't own land would actually have to provide services to the rich guys who own land, because the rich people need food, need somebody to serve them, need somebody to cook. So you kind of say, well, this is kind of like absurd. I would actually, I mentioned that I think in the book, I said, to me, Theory of Moral Sentiments, because of course it was written when Smith was still young, he just became a professor, was really very much like a job market paper. It is a paper where he tries to show himself that he is a professor of jurisprudence, and that somehow the world is benign, and it's somewhat benign because God has taken good care even of the very poor. And then I did the same thing that Facundo did with my book. I actually started counting the number of times that, as you see, the God, divine providence, or great maker are mentioned in a Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations. And of course, the difference is astonishing. The ratio is, as you can see here, is more than 55 to 1 per page. And then why do I then think that what is the world of the wealth of nations? It's the world without God. And I think this is absolutely crucial. This is the world of cold calculus and relations between individuals. And why is it more leftist? Because the way that wealth has been acquired is so many times criticized and pointed out. The rich have become rich in the wealth of nations because they plundered. Obviously, everybody knows how negative he was about East India Company, both the Dutch and the English. They plundered, they enslaved people, exploited people, they had monopolies, they used to concert themselves around, to decide how to manipulate the market and to influence the government. So the way, and actually I will not show you here, but if you take one page where I intentionally took all the statements on monopoly, monopsony, exploitation, plunder, stealing, it's absolutely striking. If you were given these sentences and not being told that it was Adam Smith, you would actually literally think that some of them would be said by Bernie Sanders. They're so strong. So suddenly it's a different world. In the theory of moral sentiments, they were rich and they were kind of ridiculed. But here, they're absolutely clobbered about the way they have acquired wealth. So let me then say why, on top of that, Adam Smith believes that the rich, that the capitalists, or they're not called capitalists, they're called employers or masters, they should not decide government policy. First, there are two critiques, as I want to say. The first one is the acquisition of wealth. Now, he does have critique of government, and he has critique even of labor unions, and he had, well, they really didn't exist, but of laborers sort of getting together, and he has a critique of the organized religion. So he's very skeptical about every association. But the striking thing, I think, and that was not, I think, appreciated enough, how negative he was about capitalists and their organizations. Now, why this trust, particularly about capitalist advice, is where does it come from? It's based on his view about the evolution of income distribution as commercial society becomes more advanced. He says there are obviously three factors of production, three returns. One is wage. He says the wage would increase as society progresses. As you probably know, he took Netherlands as the case of the most developed society. And then England comes next, Scotland follows, then France, and so forth. And then he says also the land rent would go up because there is greater demand, first, more population and greater demand from the products of the earth. So workers and landlords have an incentive for societal improvement because their incomes will go up. The only group whose income will not go up as society develops are employers. And consequently, he says, they are the only group whose interest is opposite to the social interest of improvement. And he takes against the Netherlands as an example by showing how the rate of interest and the rate of profit in Netherlands is low and wage is high. So his view on whom to follow, whom should government sort of follow in their policy making, is based on his view of the evolution of the incomes from the three factors of production. But on top of that, to be even more critical of employers, he says the problem with them is that they are close to power and they are very good in persuasion and they have the advantage of small number so they can actually associate more easily. And there was a very famous statement that the government cannot ban associations of employers, but should do nothing to make it easier for them to assemble and deceive the public. And then you sort of think, what is Davos? It's like the opposite. It's actually the government who is keen to be there with these people who have gathered there to deceive the public. And on the other hand, two other classes for landlords, Adam Smith says that they don't influence government policy because they are indolent. And for workers, he says they are ignorant and lazy. So, no, actually, the landlords are lazy and indolent, and workers are uneducated and they cannot influence. So thereby, capitalists who use sophistry and casuistry well are actually those who influence government policy, and these are the people that we should really beware the most. And I think that that part was not sufficiently realized, nor was it realized that it really stems from his view about the evolution of factor shares, or at least factor incomes. Now, this is, I will not read all of that, but this is one of the many statements where he says that one should be particularly careful to accept any proposal that comes from this order of people. So I will skip, because I'm already speaking too long, I will skip Ricardo. I mentioned him a little bit, but it's unfair to not mention, but simply maybe we'll talk about the Q&A. But because I want to say a few words on Marx. Well, we already know that inequality is class-based for Marx, like for all the classical authors, and all these other things that I already mentioned, so you can even skip this slide. It's really interpersonal income distribution is subsumed in the functional income distribution, because that's really what determines overall inequality and determines your position in the income distribution. But there is more to Marx than to the other authors. And more is because income distribution or inequality is not such a big topic for Marx. And actually, we have been so much influenced by social democracy that many people believe, okay, Marx is more radical than social democracy, so he must want greater equality. But Marx is very clear, and it's particularly clear in his later years, where he actually does the critique of the Gotha program. He says the objective of this movement is not any other than abolition of classes. Abolition of classes means the end of exploitation and the end of private ownership of capital. So the objective is not greater equality within the capitalist framework. Yes, he, of course, as you know, he participated as an activist. He wrote books. He actually gave lectures here in London to different workers' associations. He was the author of the Communist Manifesto. He was very active. But as Shlomo Vineri says, I think very well, for Marx, all that activity was, and aim was, of course, improvement of the conditions, but the tool was the improvement of a condition towards the aim, which was the abolition of a class society. And as Shlomo Vineri says, he saw trade union movement and all the organization of workers as a way of socializing workers, making them understand what are their interests, and of course, what is the great movement of history that Marx believed that he sort of discovered, and thereby leading them towards a new society and abolition of classes. So income distribution or income inequality is not an essential objective. It is, to some extent, an accidental result of the need for workers to take self-consciousness of their own position and to go for the end of capitalist system. So that's why, even there are statements, particularly by Engels, when they write about the critique of the Gotha program, where Engels says explicitly, this is not a reduction of income inequality, is not an aim of this movement. Inequality would always exist. He gives kind of interesting example that, people who live in a valley would never have exactly the same income as people who live in, hills and mountains. The inequality would always exist, and there will be always differences in personal incomes because people are different. And I will not go into that, and actually I don't go very much into the chapter, but it is about socialism and communism in Marx's own view. But very clearly he says, in socialism, then you would still have inequality because a principle of equality would be applied to unequal individuals. So if somebody works twice as much as me under socialism, he would get twice as much. So it's only in communism where that issue would disappear because of the society of abundance and whereas, you know, the famous statement that everybody would contribute according to their ability and would actually take as much as they wish according to their needs. But I wanted to mention that under the capitalist society, for Marx, reduction of income distribution is not an ultimate objective. Now, what I want also to say, and I will finish with that, is that when I discuss the income distribution in Marx, I look at what he writes about wages, labor and wages, and profit and capitalism. Now, on wages, I have to insist because very often people who have not read Marx believe that he held the iron law of wages. No, that's simply not true. He actually made fun of Lassalle, who introduced the term, and Marx never thought that wages would be at a subsistence regardless of the level of development of society. And this is very clear from 2 or 3 reasons, or 3 sources. The first of all, in Marx, you have complex and simple labor. So by definition, there are various levels of wages depending on the skill level of workers. Now, if the lowest is the subsistence, because it cannot be below subsistence, then others must be above subsistence by definition. Secondly, Marx shows very clearly in examples, there are several numerical examples where he shows that wages differ real wages differ, depending on development of a country. Like Smith before, he uses, again, I think it was England on top, and France, then Germany, Austria, and Russia, very clearly. So what is the implication of that? That wages are not given as a subsistence regardless of where the society is in development. And then finally, he says very explicitly, there are 2 components to the wage rate, a physiological and a historical. The physiological, you can say, is given by the number of calories that we need to have and whatever. It's a little bit like what Bob Allen is doing in his work, or the World Bank is doing with $1.90. But then there is a historical part which is driven by the level of development. Now, I want to insist on that because I think that one can I'm not saying that Marx necessarily made this, but when one puts together and tries to get a sort of income distribution according to Marx or interpretation of Marx, I think that one can argue that Marx entertained the view of the secular increase of real wages under capitalist regime or society. I think one can definitely reject the view that Marx believed in immiseration of the proletariat, and that view is based only on 2 quotations, one of them from the manifesto, when Marx was 29 years of age and actually did not even study political economy. So that's why I actually spent quite a lot of time on the wage issue, and the link there is also between the wage and the fact that subsistence is a historical category. Even subsistence is a historical category, and so much more the wage. And that was a very interesting part where Marx discusses the historicity of needs. And he says in very poor society, the needs are limited because simply our needs are determined by what we believe at a given historical development or the place, what are the things that we need. But if you're in a very poor society, you would not have the same needs as people in London would have. And so not only is the wage a historical category, but the needs are a historical category, the needs which underlie the subsistence. And it would be very, very strange that everything is historical category in Marx, except the wage rate is given forever. That actually does not, logically, does not really follow from what Marx, neither textually nor logically from what Marx has written. I will skip the discussion of capital, and this is, of course, the whole enormous chapter, which, I mean, there are 6 chapters in the volume 3, but the enormous discussion that has been produced by the tendency of the profit rate to fall. I would just use that simply to then say, to put labor and capital together. And my argument is that Marx did not have a single theory of income distribution or development of income distribution as societies advance, capitalist society advanced, that Marx was not a sort of Victorian determinist, but that based on him, one can have at least 2 different views. And actually, I would argue that the view which is supporting the secular increase in real wage under capitalism and rejects the immiseration theory is stronger based on textual evidence and on analytics. So essentially we have then to put all of this together. Inequality reducing forces are the increase in real wage and the tendency of the profit rate to fall. I mean, the reasons are obvious because capitalists are richer than workers. So if their source of income goes down and workers' real wage goes up, we would have an decrease in income inequality. But they are also offsetting forces. And that's very important in Marx. You know, I'm not going to read them all, but the offsetting forces on the labor side is the presence of the reserve army of labor, which always puts the damper on the increase of real wage, de-skilling of labor, which comes with technological development, and on the other hand, there are inequality increasing forces on the capital side with crisis, which actually increase the rate of profit, with the expansion to the new areas of production. Obviously, Rosa Luxemburg was using that in the geographical sense, but you can use it for, you know, production, creation of you know, Uber or Airbnb or whatever, and concentration of capital. So the bottom line then, it's my last slide, is that I think that you can have, based on Marx, who never actually, he never put the things together. You can have an optimistic scenario where you have a secular increase in real wages and a secular decline in the rate of profit. And you can have, I mean, people have argued in the past and still now that there is another scenario, which is the immiseration of labor and ever greater concentration of capital. So that's the very opposite of the optimistic scenario. And as I said, I believe that the optimistic scenario is more coherent and more in accordance with Marx's writing, but that scenario implies three things. It implies, in that interpretation, increase in real wage, a reduced labor share. That's very important because there is no doubt that Marx believes that the labor share would go down, and the reduction in the rate of profit. And if you look at actually current reality of the last 30 years in rich societies, you actually see that all of these three things, I mean, I'm not sure about the rate of profit, but it probably has gone up, not down. But certainly the labor share has gone down and the real wage has increased. And finally, you can then combine, this is my own combination, that's not in Marx, is that you can actually combine positive and negative elements from these two interpretations, and you can actually argue that there could be a polarized society where you have a secular increase in wage rates, but you have concentration of capital or higher share of the top 1%, if you want to use the more sort of contemporary language. Or you can even speak of a regressive society where you have immiseration of labor and a secular decline in profits, which then would imply a reduction in the value added overall. So consequently, it is consistent only with a reduction in income per capita. No, these are not things which are in Marx, the white ones, but the gray ones, I think, can be found if you want them to find. And the reason why in the past the breakdown was popular, because the left wing and communist movement at the turn of the previous century believed that it actually presaged the end of capitalism. So they liked that scenario because they said, look, we have really a fundamental problem under capitalism which would be exacerbated when the crisis of overproduction take place. Henry Grossman, I think, is a good example of that. And then we would have the breakdown of capitalism. Now, the right wing has more recently liked that scenario because they say, look, your great maître à penser Marx was totally wrong because there was no immiseration of labor and there was, well, about greater concentration of capital, they cannot be so sure, but they say it was all wrong. And as I said before, I think it's really based on very little of textual evidence in some cases, especially when it comes to wage that is considered to be unchangeable regardless of society. I think it's just plain wrong and it has no support in Marx's own thinking. So I would stop here. I already spoke too long, and I would be very happy, of course, that you asked me for chapters that I don't even touch, like in the presentation, like Pareto, which is an important chapter of its own right, but we would have to stay here for several hours. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Branko. I guess it's the place. The intuition Branko has just had during the presentation in selecting Smith and Marx is imposed by the weight of Smith and Marx. We cannot do without this, and reveals that the conversation is between these two authors. As in the Oscar, those are the actors in the leading role. The rest are supporting actors. Ricardo is very relevant, but this is something that it may be tough for us to understand from a university perspective, where these authors are treated today as marginally. They are the leading roles, they have played the leading role, and for reasons we do understand and for reasons we do not understand, we need people like Branko to bring them back to the forefront of the discussion and the debate. So now we open the floor to questions. We start with the people here in the theater. So if you raise your hands, remember to give your name and affiliation. Come on. Here you have the first.
Hi, I'm Ihsan Basir. I'm a postdoc here in the economics department here at LSE. I wanted to just ask you about the last slide the second last slide where you talked about Marx. One of the things Marx notes or postulates is about de-skilling, and that is one of the tendencies which leads to an increase in inequality, at least between classes. I mean, as we all know that at least in the last 30 years, a big part of the literature on inequality is kind of skill bias, technical change, and the upskilling and the increase in the higher education level of the labor force. And so I wanted to ask if number one, in your reading, that Marx did indeed was too strong on that in terms of predicting that, and in actual fact it came out to be much more contingent on technology and the waves of complementarity, and whether maybe that's one of the reasons why Marx didn't pay as much attention to interpersonal inequality, because as we see now, it actually does that aspect that has made it much more important.
I would be I will be quite brief on that because I really don't discuss it very much. But I think it's a very good topic for a dissertation or something, because Marx does actually believe that technological progress leads to the replacement of, let's suppose, middle skill level labor by lower skill labor, because the tasks get simplified. And you have more and more people who just do very simple tasks. I mean, for me, the example is like supermarket. When I was a kid and I grew up in Yugoslavia, in supermarkets, people had to know to add numbers, right? And I remember when I came to the United States, nobody knew how to add numbers. Because in the supermarket, you don't need to add numbers even in the past, before the machines with codes came, because it was already then known. You would just type it into the machine, and people sometimes would make mistakes because they would not think about it. But that's clearly this killing of labor. So that was what Marx had in mind, and he, I think, followed very much Smith there, because Smith, of course, believed that the source of advancement is in the division of labor. But he actually writes about the division of labor of making people stupid. And when he contrasts intelligence of the rural people favorably to the intelligence of the urban people, poor people, he says everybody who has conversed with a poor person in urban areas knows that they are much stupider than people in the rural areas, because division of labor leads them to do one task forever. They don't have time to do anything else except sleeping and going to the tavern. And I think Marx very much followed that. Now, I don't know today's literature that well, and I didn't want to engage in that, but I think it's an interesting contrast that can be studied much more.
Next question. I'm sorry to point. No, go ahead.
Hi, Jonathan Berman, King's College. So something that I guess was very different when Marx and and Smith wrote the books is that state capacity was very low at the time. So they almost don't discuss much institutions the way we think about institutions today. So most of their explanations to whatever they're observing is kind of more organic or not dictated by how states are shaped, and definitely not the way states are so central nowadays. So kind of trying to bring this to nowadays, I mean, thinking about your last slide more seriously, I'm wondering what role do you think that states would play in kind of relating to anything, at least these two were saying?
I had to answer this question a couple of times with respect to Smith, because people from the right, I actually had a very nice discussion with the professor from George Mason. They're right in the sense where they say, look, Smith, and I mentioned this in the book, he had 4 functions for the government, but he could not have imagined that the government would spend 50% of GDP. In France, the government spends now 60% of GDP. He could not have imagined that. And so it is true that the functions that he explicitly has there, including the one that is interesting, is actually funding for the public education, elementary education. I don't think that they would actually take more than 10% of GDP overall. So I do agree with that, but we have, of course, to situate Smith in that sense in the context of the time. There are, funding of the elementary education was something radical, and the mention of progressive taxation as well, because there was one sentence where he says that taxes should be paid in accordance to income, and maybe a little bit more than accordance to income for the rich people. So he does open the door for progressive taxation. So I would agree with you that they would not, I think for Marx, since Jonathan, you're one of the we were both authors of this Homo Plutii. One of the things that Marx would not have also imagined is the existence of rich people who are rich in terms of labor income and capital income. It just was not something that was part of the view of the world which they had, and I don't think that they are less relevant for certain, how should I say, not omissions. Clearly, we are all limited by our historical experience. You cannot really know what will happen in 100 years.
Thank you, Branko. We go to online. There's no online questions, so the floor is completely yours.
Yeah.
There.
I'm Tony Shorrock. So I was originally at LSE on the staff and a student here. So, in fact, I think I may have written the first PhD on inequality, and I also taught the first course on inequality. So that is my credentials, if you like. I was hoping you promised us something about more recent times, and in particular, what I regard as the lean years. Basically, I suppose from maybe the 60s, but certainly the 70s and 80s, clearly inequality topics fell out of fashion, and I think I'd really like to hear your at least views on why it happened. My suggestions might be, first of all, there was a great focus on data, which there wasn't before. So, I mean, data became very important, and you could just trace really the big data sets that we just take for granted now didn't exist in the 1960s. The other thing is that there was really just a shift to the US. I mean, the US dominated the academic discussion. I guess, I mean, MIT is always, so there was it became much more technical and also much more right-wing in the sense of the sort of Chicago group, human capital ideas, these sorts of change in emphasis, which I think changed quite dramatically and led to what I think about the lean years, if you like, when it was really quite difficult to make contributions to this research, and at least it wasn't valued in the same way that it is now. I
could not agree more with everything that you said. I mentioned, and I would be very brief on that, I mentioned before that I think we have to look at socialism, and that's why actually that chapter 7 opens with studies of income distribution under socialism, because that claim of classlessness really was crucial in the competition between USA and the USSR. And there was a shift, as you said, actually, of the economic profession towards the United States. And you know, this is very, I actually give lots of examples, very obvious in like top textbooks like Samuelson. You know, Samuelson, people don't think of this, but Samuelson discusses quite a lot labor is labor. He discusses in Capital, never puts them together. And income distribution appears in towards the last chapters, in income distribution where the Gini coefficient is introduced, the Lorentz curve, in developing countries. So the only countries that have inequality problem are developing countries, not in advanced countries. It's very symptomatic of the age. And of course, I participated myself in doing empirical work, but I think it's what I call it now, is uber empiricism. We didn't have anything to say about the integration of income distribution with political decisions. And the very important authors at the time who actually spent lots of time and contributed enormously to our much better knowledge of income distribution, avoided linking that to any political debates or changes. So, for example, you have the entire study of wealth inequality in the UK, which, without any reference to whether, you know, it was this government or that government, whether there was a franchise was extended to women or not, whether there were strikes. It's not. It just comes, the tax rates come from somewhere. And I think that actually has changed afterwards. And I think Piketty's contribution, including his first book about the high incomes in France, was quite important because it integrated the empirical data with politics. And finally, let me just say, if I may, there are some parts of the book, in that chapter, that are autobiographical, and I remember, and I'm very tough on that. I remember in 1976, actually, I went to the American Cultural Center in Belgrade because I saw that they had a book by Alan Blinder, which was his theory of income distribution dissertation. And I went and got that book. And on the way back home, I started looking at it. I said, well, this book has nothing of any relevance to anybody who lives in this world. You know, we are talking in the middle of 20th century where we had 2 world wars, we had massive expropriation of assets, we had deflation and inflation, we had destruction, we have government seizing assets, we have people becoming rich on exploitation, and he has these models. Incredible. I mean, I actually list all the assumptions that are made, that you know your wage until the end of your life, that you know the discount rate, that you know the interest rate, that you know how many children you would have, that you know wages of your child. I mean, this is madness. And that I actually, at the same time, I read Samir Amin's Accumulation on a Global Scale, and one of the thoughts that I had actually originally in this book is to put Samir Amin as number 7. However, my knowledge of, I have to say, of dependencia and structuralist is not sufficient. I know Cardoso, and actually I wanted, Samir Amin, I think his original book was extremely important, and I mentioned that because suddenly, for the first time, income distribution in a given country is determined also by external forces. So you have, in his dissertation, why bourgeoisie has such a role in Egypt. It's because in international division of labor, this is the role that they have to play in Egypt. So it's for the first time, nobody before, not even Marx, although he did a little bit towards the end of his life about globalization. For me, Samir Amin was personally a very important author. But I was not as impressed with his later works, and then I just didn't include him like a number 7 author. And let me just say also, well, final note, I will not name that person, but there was somebody quite well known who actually, when they discussed my book, he said, so why don't you, I mean, when I mentioned Samir Amin, and he said, well, but nobody has studied him as such department. But I said, okay, you can write history of how income distribution was studied at your department, but I didn't write that history. So I think one has, this is not a sort of review of a literature for the Journal of Economic Literature. It's not, it's different.
We have a question on the right.
Hello, my name's Tim. I used to be an alumni. I wanted to know your reasons for writing the book, and also how your views, your personal views on inequality changed writing the book, and also in particular after the book was published and you were receiving, you know, criticisms and reviews of the book, and I was just interested in how your views would change.
I wrote it, it's a very difficult question to answer. All six of the authors are people whom I've been reading. Actually, Marx, I started reading Marx when I was 19. So, you know, I read him throughout my life. And Smith probably in mid-20s first time. But much later I read Theory of Moral Sentiments. So these are not people whom I read because of the book. Now, because of the book, I started reading things that I have not read from them. Including, as I said, for example, Ricardo's letters, which I really enjoyed very much. And of course, parts of, you know, Marx now has, I think, 130 volumes of everything that he has written. So obviously, nobody can read that. But I read some of his letters. And obviously, Grundrisse was something that I actually bought that in London, I remember, when it was published with Martin Nicolaus translation and so on. Okay, so I wanted basically to recapture that, my past readings. And then how did they, you know, I changed my views as I was writing this, and I became much more critical, including of my own writings. I mentioned twice, both negatively, in the book, because it was empirical, and there was, as I was saying before, not to repeat, it really was unrelated to the political developments, and I think that's not what income distribution studies should be.
We have another question at the back, right side. Right for us.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I appreciate the outline that you gave of the 6 thinkers and how they're related. I'm curious if you considered anyone outside of Europe and if you considered any female thinkers as well.
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually thought of this. People from the other people that people ask me why they are not there. Keynes, for example, and I wrote a Substack about that, so I don't want to repeat. But among the female thinkers, Rosa Luxemburg was the one that actually, I didn't think that I would have the whole you know, chapter, but she is one that was mentioned. John Robinson also. So that would be, you know, for female thinkers. And let me see who else was mentioned about possible omissions. I cannot remember, but Keynes was quite a few times people ask me, like, why not Keynes?
While I pass to the next question, let me ask a question myself. Towards the end of the book, or while writing the book, do you have the feeling, the intuition, that for the political economy tradition, inequality is not a topic and should not be a topic, because that should be, that's the study of the inequality with the capitalist system, which is something we don't want to do when we want to transform the system. So reducing inequality within the system would be a silly idea from the political economic tradition.
Well, that's a tough one, you know, because of course it takes actually it takes beyond Marx's position, because it essentially can be interpreted as saying that we should actually have higher inequality so that the system collapses sooner. I don't think that Marx had this view, this apocalyptic view. But as I was saying before, I don't think that for Marx, reduction of income inequality was so important. And I think this is important to underline, because I think it is also very often misinterpreted. Well, by people who have not read Marx and who somehow believe that he was a social democrat. And I don't think that he was a social democrat. But I don't think he was apocalyptic. And as what our opinions should be, I think it's up to each individual. So I cannot, yeah.
We have a question at the back. Yeah, there.
Thanks for the presentation. I'm a student in the Executive Master of Public Administration, so definitely not an economist by background. But I was interested in your view on kind of the idea that Stiglitz has that inequality is self-perpetuating and the role that technology, and especially right now, things like OpenAI and this last wave of AI technology development will have on inequality. And the follow-up question is, what do you think is the role of government in kind of mitigating this effect, if it's negative?
I'm actually glad that you mentioned Stiglitz because he's one of relatively few number of authors. He's not the only one, but whom actually write in that period of, as you called it very well, lean years, positively, because again, I was very favorably impressed with his, I think 1966 or so paper, where he introduces a heterogeneous agent. And actually that was, I think, a big change because, of course, people are distinguished in his paper by the difference of in the amount of capital they own. So I think, you know, I liked that paper and I still remember it. And one time I actually asked Joe even to sign off on the book from which actually where I read it. But on the other questions that really have to do much more with the present, obviously they are not in the book. There is no artificial intelligence. I don't know, I can speculate on that. Sometimes I think that actually it's not very much different from Ricardo's, you know, famous chapter on machinery. Artificial intelligence is a machine, you know, if robots look like us, it doesn't mean that they are not machines. But I don't know, I think it's hard to say, but I think that on balance, I would see that as increasing the capital share.
Any other question? Comment? Comment.
Yeah, so thanks so much for the presentation. And I wanted to ask about the term exploitation. Well, I'm a student here at LSE at Sociology Department, and I read Max Weber's critique of Marx, where he says that Marx is using too many normative, moralistic, non-scientific terms like exploitation. So what do you think about, well, the value of the term, and yeah, why do you think it is useful as a concept?
I would disagree on that. Actually, in Marx, exploitation is not a moralistic term. Exploitation is simply defined as the presence of the surplus value, which is greater than zero. So as long as there is greater than zero surplus value, which means greater than zero profit, you have exploitation. But it's a technical term. It's a technical term. You know, he could have called this something else. So it's not a moralistic term.
Any other comment, question? There, at the back, on the left side, for us.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. My name is August. I'm an MSc student in International Political Economy. I'm wondering if any of your research sheds any light on inequality not only within nations, but among nations, and how we can understand that today.
Well, most of my work is actually on global inequality, so, but it's not discussed in this book. As I said before, the issue of inequalities between the nations, well, they are present, of course, in Smith. I mean, Smith is, I forgot maybe, well, there are so many things in my book, I have to say. But for example, for Smith, what I did is I used, Smith discusses quite a lot level of income in different countries. And I used the words that he uses, for advanced society, then stagnant society, then I forgot what is the use for the declining society, and then barbarous society. I think there are about 5 societies that he distinguishes. And then I put countries that he has identified as exemplars or belonging to these several categories. And then I used the Madison most recent version of the data about GDP per capita for around 1776. It's remarkable how Smith was close to actually putting the right number. Well, he didn't have number, but how perceiving society is almost the same as we now with much more data. I think that Portugal is the only country which is off, but really there is a dozen of countries there, or regions, that are included, and he was quite good. So he actually had, maybe because of his experience of travel to France and Switzerland, maybe because of his reading, maybe he was commissioner of customs, but he had a pretty good perception about income distribution, income inequalities between countries. Another interesting detail, and I can go on forever, but I'll stop, is to look at the difference in the treatment of China between Quesnay and Smith. Quesnay, as you know, was a great admirer, probably you know, a great admirer of China. He had a whole book which is called Despotisme de la Chine, but the word despotisme is not in a negative sense, it's actually used in a positive sense. Despotism means a ruler who is making sure that the laws are observed. So he had a whole book which actually is against Montesquieu, but the book is 120 pages. But then when you come to Smith, he has only negative things to say about China, including that fairly well-known statement that the Chinese in Canton eat the food that was thrown in bones that are thrown from the Western English ships into the water. So the view of China is very different between the two. And then, of course, Marx has, particularly, as I said before, in the last 15 to 20 years of his life, I think partly because of the reception of capital in Russia, starts really thinking and much more about global issues, including India and civil war in the US and so on. So yes, but it's not obviously. I could write another book just with that topic. So it's not the major topic in my book, but it is a major topic in my work.
Another question there.
Hello, my name's Ray Thompson. Thank you very much. I'm academically unaffiliated. I'm just wondering about the present state of things. The kind of folkloric version is that inequality is on the increase, and it looks as if capitalism is going to burn the planet before it addresses the question of inequality. I'm just asking you as an expert whether you think this situation is sustainable.
I would be brief on this. It's, of course, a very complicated question, particularly the second part about the climate change. It's really, first, I'm not an expert on that. Secondly, I think it's very contentious. Third, I think the only thing that I believe, from my perspective, when I do global inequality studies, and the only thing that I think I can say with some reasonable, how should I say, certitude, is that further divergence of Africa with respect to the rest of the world would be exacerbated by climate change. That would particularly negatively affect countries in Africa because of droughts and dependence on agriculture and so on. So, and that's the only part on the second question that I can say with some degree of confidence. Yeah.
Another question there at the center.
Thanks for a great talk. From the little I know, it seems like Pareto and Kuznets, their theories at least have been used more explicitly related to income distribution. Was there anything that you found, maybe reading some of their lesser well-known works, that you found surprising or unexpected?
Oh, from Pareto or Kuznets, or just... you know, I was quite, I didn't speak of him today, but I was quite impressed with Pareto, that I read more of. He's not as unidimensional as he sometimes is implied. He likes, of course, I think there was a very strong element of, I actually discussed also the styles of writing of all of them. I think there is a very strong element of épater le bourgeois, which is present in Pareto. So he really likes to shock you. And I actually think that he would have found, loving paradoxes, he would have found the fact that he's not so well known today, particularly not, I think, in sociological literature, as perversely a sort of a revindication of his views, because their views were always elitistic, and the views were that you cannot, that you cannot teach the truth, because the truth fundamentally is such that societies would be destroyed, so every teaching has to be the teaching of a myth, of some ideology, which he called with non-experimental or logistic science, and consequently that the fact that he's in oblivion is a proof of his importance. So I actually, there were certain parts of Pareto that I liked, even that I said I find his, how should I say, writing sometimes intentionally provocative. And Kuznets is the very opposite. Kuznets knew law, obviously, he was one of the founders of national accounts, he knew he's a demographer, he actually has an impressive knowledge, but that impressive knowledge is written in a fairly sort of, how should I say, not very attractive way, with sentences that go on forever and then have subordinate clauses and there are exceptions and all of that. So he is not, I sometimes actually wrote a Substack about that, if I had dinner, because you get to know them. The only one that I don't have a real feeling is Quesnay. But if I had dinner with, we had dinner with 5 of them, I think I would predict the behavior, I think reasonably well. And I would find Kuznets the most boring of them as an individual, which doesn't mean, as I said, I think he's, I also mentioned that maybe with Keynes, he's the greatest economist of the 20th century, because he was fundamental in two key parts of economics, national accounts and income distribution.
Another question?
Hello. I'm a PhD student from SOAS. You mentioned that you are looking now, after having done this work, you look a little bit more critically on your empirical work. And given that your empirical work is really popular, and I think everyone learned in their class about the elephant curve. So what would you say now about the elephant curve? What is something that you might have missed that you would like to add now in our classroom here?
No, you know, I'm very critical of my, let's say, earlier work. I don't think that actually, but that part was not part of my book, so I didn't discuss global inequality or anything like that. But I think the elephant curve was political. And the reason why it became very popular was because it was political, and I wrote it explicitly. I mean, I accepted the political interpretation, I contributed to a political interpretation. So I think that that part of my work, and more recent work also, with inequality of opportunity, which depends on country, we're looking at, for the, well, maybe not the first time, but in terms of data for the first time, at inequality of opportunity as a sort of beyond the nation state. I think that these are all political things. So, but I didn't write positively about that because, you know, there is no between country inequality in my in this book. So I would say I was negative about the first period of my empirical work. For example, I did quite a lot of work on Eastern Europe, and I reread some of that. There is nothing really with political developments. So really numbers change, but whether, Solidarność is there or not, if Gomulka is the party leader, if Yugoslavia is so fragmented politically, it's not there. So I said, well, that's what I missed.
Yes, we have two. One at the front.
Thank you for the talk. I'm just very curious, how would you see Amartya Sen fitting into this frameworks? And how would,
I knew it would come. I actually, to be very short, I disagree with his interpretation of the theory of moral sentiments versus the wealth of nations. I actually think that it has done harm because I think that the interpretation was driven by the principle in the two. The principles are true. It's empathy or sympathy in one, and the granite of self-interest in the other. But it does not mean that the left-wing people have to take empathy, which justifies huge inequality, as something good. And I try to explain, actually, there's quite a lot of that is in the book, really that, I'm really thinking, and I think I can prove that theory of moral sentiments is a Panglossian attempt to explain away observable inequality. And the wealth of nation is not. So I take that as an indication of being left versus right, not what is clearly the principle of empathy versus self-interest.
And there was another question there. And I think that will be the final question, because it's almost 8. No.
Thank you. I'm Alberto. I am a master's student of economics in Brazil. So what I found interesting in the first slide is that we can see that the most important economists have talked about inequality since the beginning, since Quesnay, Smith, Marx. My question is, a lot of people, me at least in the beginning of my studies, was that inequality was a matter of other social scientists and not economists. And my question is, what's your take on why economics as a science has talked about inequality since Adam Smith, for example, and why inequality has been an important subject in mainstream economics for so recently, not for more time?
Well, this is all in chapter 7. But I totally agree with you. I mean, I had friends, I had young people who have told me, they say, okay, I'm interested in inequality, I would like to study. And the professors my age, or maybe younger, they would say, no, this is not in economics, you go to sociology, or anthropology, or somewhere else. I mean, this, honestly, is madness. I mean, that cannot be explained by, but I do explain it. I think, actually, the decline, the lean years, the eclipse in capitalist economies were the product of the first one that I mentioned, attempt claim of classlessness because of the ideological competition, endogenous change within economics profession that went really in a more abstract way of treating, as Lionel Robbins defined, economics is really a science, with essentially like optimization, or you can, call it almost programming, and the funding of economics by the rich. And the rich don't like the term, even the term inequality. I wrote about that before. I was working at a think tank in Washington, and there was a very nice director who really liked my work, but she told me, you have all this like CV, and there are too many words which are inequality. And when I go and ask for funding, they don't like to see that. So she says, why don't you change every inequality but put poverty? because then we will get funding. So there are three reasons. I think the first is a political reason. The second is sort of endogenous changes within economics profession. Probably going back to Marshall, I don't know, I would not. And the third one is really funding by the rich. But likewise, why in socialist economies it was not studied, there are somewhat different reasons. First was about, the end of capitalism as a class. So if your whole framework is capitalist labor, suddenly capitalists disappear. And objectively, you have a problem how to do that. And on top of that, there was a political, how should I say, unacceptance of studies which would claim indirectly or directly that there are large income differences in an ostensibly classless society. So that was one of the reasons on the socialist side. And actually give a very nice table, you would actually probably enjoy that, from the 1977 sociological research in Yugoslavia, which asked people, is Yugoslavia a class-based society or not? And then as income level increases, more people claim that it's classless. So the higher you're in income distribution, the more you claim the society has no classes. Also, the membership in the League of Communist Yugoslavia was strongly positively correlated with the claim of classlessness. And then I take another example from the similar study in the US where people were asked, do actually inheritance, connection, and parental wealth help you achieve high position in society or not? And of course, the same answer, the richer you go in income distribution, the more people claim that it doesn't matter. What matters is really indirectly was merit. So I think there was this class element which was there, was ignored, and it was ignored for the three reasons that I mentioned, and consequently the studies were really either uber empirical studies or were theoretical studies which had no relationship whatsoever with reality.
Well, let me closing by saying that in the case of classical authors, Branko's Smith may not agree with your Smith or may not agree with my Smith. Yep. Branko's Marx is not my Marx, may not be your Marx, or it may. But another very positive feature of the book is that the authors are there. And the book, my proposal to you, if you have not read it, is to approach it not as a history of economic thought book, but these authors are key and these authors have clues for the present. And this is my proposal, my suggestion of how to approach this book. And as a suggestion, as an invitation also to go back to those authors and see what they have to say about our present, the things they saw and could not understand at that time, but they did, and that's why they are great, and that's why Branko cannot do without them. He's not writing about minor or disappeared authors.
But I totally agree. I would also to say, if you read the book, it is my view of the authors. As I said before, it's not a literature review. It's my view, and there, even in the last chapter I mentioned, there are also some autobiographical elements. So you have to base your view on your reading, and I think one of the hopes is that would actually provoke more people or lead more people to actually read these authors and to form, as Facundo said, their own view on them.
So I invite you to keep the conversation with Branko outside. I guess that there will be a book signing if you want to stay. And let me also thank you, our BSL interpreters. And thank you, Branko, for being here with us and engaging in the conversation and in this long session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.